Good evening. Welcome. This will begin the executive session for approximately 15 minutes. The purpose of this executive session is to evaluate the qualifications of applicants for public employment and to discuss with legal counsel potential litigation and the legal or financial risks of a course of action. We will return for our special meeting at approximately 5 p.m. Go and enjoy the sunshine until then.
Good evening. It is 5 p.m. and I am now calling our special meeting to order. Welcome. This is a special meeting of the Kent School District Board, which is held in public to comply with the Open Public Meetings Act. The purpose of this special meeting is a presentation, a discussion and approval agenda, and a consent agenda. We thank those of you who have come to this meeting and those who are viewing on live stream. Mr. Brockvogel, our General Counsel, will be attending this meeting via Zoom. And that'll take us to 1.03, which is roll call. At this time, the board will take a roll call for attendance. I will call each board member's name, and if they're present, they will say here or whatever they want to say. Director Farah?
Present.
Director Clark?
Present.
Director Hamada?
Present.
Vice President Margell?
Present.
And of course, I am here. And so I'm going to go to 2.0 for presentations, and I'm going to call on Superintendent Vela to start the presentation.
Thank you, President Bennett. Welcome to our board. I'd like to invite Mr. Ben Rarick, our Associate Superintendent of Finance, to begin our presentation this evening.
Good evening, board members. It's my pleasure to present a brief PowerPoint presentation, which I anticipate take about 10 minutes. Just by way of general orientation, recall that you have essentially two resolutions before you this evening. The effect of these resolutions would be to place two levies on the ballot for the November slot, the November 23 ballot. You also have a memo in your packet that links to all of the previous presentations and materials that you've been provided. I'm going to work briskly through this presentation because a lot of what you see will be review for you, but for disclosure to the community, we're providing this presentation. So at 44 schools, 25,000 students, and over 3,800 staff, obviously we're a growing and increasingly complex organization. A couple things to note about these two resolutions is that the effect of this would be to place the vast majority, almost all of our funding, on the ballot in November. So this underscores the critical nature of success in November. And I would also encourage the board members that even though these two resolutions are separate, they're really sort of a package, because it doesn't make particular sense, I would argue, to do one or the other in November, than to do them both in November. The next two slides highlight the current baseline of funding for both the EP&O and capital levy. We're currently at about 15% for local levies in EP&O, but remember that number is going to go up, up, up as our federal funding recedes, right? So it's been as high as 20% in the past, and I expect that we would return to that level. In the capital environment, currently our capital fund balance is about 42% from bond proceeds and 53% for capital levies, and this would have the effect of increasing that orange amount. We're going to talk about the two levies conceptually. First, we're going to talk about the EP&O levy. As we've stated, it funds about 15% of our total general fund resources, and it funds a lot of the programs and services that we really cherish for our students. A program that is funded just by state funding is really a bare bones and ultimately insufficient program for our kids, and the local levy provides those needed enhancements for things like athletic activities and extracurriculars, music and arts. And although not every employee is aware of this, every employee group in the district is in some way supported by the EP&O levy. We think of three major buckets of activities with the EP&O levy. This is not an exhaustive list, but it is a good way to think about it. The first is the list of student supports supported by EP&O. The second is academic programs and classroom supports. And the third is activities, athletics, and enrichment. When we talk about student support, here's a couple of illustrative examples. When we think about our safety and our security apparatus, including our personnel, or we think about our school health professionals and support services, both of those employee groups are vastly underfunded when it comes to state funding, and therefore rely on EP&O funding. When it comes to our academic programs and classroom supports, and I cannot emphasize this enough, we would not have a sufficient and valid special education program in this district without the support of our local voters, nor would we have a thriving multilingual education program. Those both rely heavily on our local EP&O levy. We also fund paraeducators, professional development, substitute teachers, curriculum materials and training, and ultimately reduced class size as well, because a number of our teachers are funded out of the local levy. In the third category, we think about co-curricular and extracurricular activities like athletics and enrichment, and even some classwork where if we offer a specialized class like an AP or IB where the class size might be unusually small, or there might be extra intensive material needs to offer those programs, that's not necessarily funded by the state. That relies on the contributions of our local taxpayers. Our dual language program, our sports and extracurricular, and our safety and security that we offer at those programs also relies on EP&O. So I think we're at 6 minutes. I'm going to shift to the capital and technology levy. And when we think of the capital and technology levy, we are thinking about essentially two buckets, right? We're thinking about the capital portion, which is more of the capital construction and maintenance, renovation costs, and then also our student one-to-one initiative in the technology levy. Might be helpful to think about them in four broad categories. The first being some of our health and safety need as it relates to facilities. Second, some of the critical improvements that need to be made in our facilities. Third, our commitment to technology education for our students, particularly through our one-to-one laptop program. And finally, some program expansion, which we will get into. When we talk about health and safety, as a public school district, we have a responsibility to make sure our buildings are safe and healthy. And part of that is healthy ventilation systems, which, depending on the time of year you're talking about, might be pertaining to providing cooling systems, heating systems, or just clean air, right? Making sure that ventilation is up to code. Similarly, we have a responsibility to have modernized safety systems, which includes for fire, but also for intrusions. When it comes to our technology education program, we're speaking mostly about the continued commitment of our one-to-one laptop program for students, which has been, we believe, a very significant success, and we have lots to show for that. But it's not just the machines, right? There's a whole apparatus around the machines, including the staffing, training, software support necessary to launch a program of that magnitude for 25,000 students. And it also includes our commitment to stay up to date with cybersecurity and data security requirements when you have that many people on devices. We have critical improvements, and I know the board is well aware of these critical improvements as we've had discussions as a community about this, certainly well prior to the bond. But just to name a few, we have schools that need roof repairs, that need new boilers. We have schools, as you've heard from members of the community, who compete athletically on dirt fields which turn to mud and are therefore not particularly safe. And so synthetic fields bring her to a safer environment for those activities. We have flooring that is aged and presents risks, and we have facilities in need of fresh paint. We also have a commitment to expand our preschool program, and that commitment requires facility space, right? So part of what would be committed to here is the ability to build out a preschool program to every elementary school and to offer accessible and inclusive playground equipment at all the elementary schools. The final slides provide an overview of some of the numbers. This slide is simply a reiteration of what you will see on the ballot. These are the numbers that you see on the ballot. One thing I want to point out briefly, you see a big increase from the first year to the second year in the technology capital levy. I just want to say for the record, that doesn't mean that's a big spike in the ask or a big spike in the tax rate. All that is the timing of when the technology levy renews. And so it's not till the second year that component. So don't misinterpret that as some big giant new ask. You'll see later in the subsequent slides that the total ask and the tax rate remain relatively flat. And I'll get to that here in a second. We've done this in the past to show how do we speak plain language to our community and our taxpayers about the cost. And so the next couple of slides take an example home of $500,000. I realize the average home is more than $500,000, but it provides a flat number that people can scale to think about their home. And really what I want you to take away from this is that the total amount of the ask year to year is going up by about inflation, about IPD. So about 3.5%. It's not exactly 3.5% in each year, but by the end it's an average ranging from 3 to 4%. And this illustrates that on a chart. So you can see we make, in consultation with our financial advisor to say, okay, what's a sensible assumption about property values, whatever. And to say, yeah, it looks like, in that first year, if there isn't significant new construction, somebody could expect to pay about $60 more, for example, on a home of that size. The final slide provides historical context. So we've heard a lot about taxes and a lot about tax rates, but it's worth noting that we are in a period of time now where our tax rate still remains very competitive with our local neighbors, but also is the lowest rate that we've had going all the way back to 2014 when you put it against per $1,000 of assessed property value. So that was 12 minutes. So that completes my presentation. And just to reiterate that I go through that briskly, not because this isn't extremely important, but that you have been given this material now for a third time. And so I want to be respectful of your time in that regard. And to again urge that this really is conceptually a package. The two resolutions sit together as one in the sense that if it makes much less sense to vote one yes. It really is planned as a combination package. That completes my presentation, and I'm happy to field any questions that board members may have.
For my colleagues, it looks like Mr. Director Clark has a question.
So I'm still I realize you're trying to use the new terminology of an educational program and operations levy, but
Yes.
in my mind, that'll be M&O forever. 'Cause
Okay.
I had to live
All
with
right.
it forever.
That's helpful to know, actually.
But the problem I've got is, of course, once again, we're discussing things like music and band and nurses showing up as funded under that. And supposedly the McCleary lawsuit was supposed to bring that under control. So I just need a statement of what happened.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely correct. So it would be, I think, a fair statement to say that, yeah, we have to say that the state has made some progress, particularly over the last 5 years, but there are still critical components of our program, the ones that you mentioned, a glaring one is special education, that are nowhere near fully funded. They made some progress on counselors, for example, but they tend to laud these very specific victories when we're looking at an entire arena of unfunded costs across the district. And the vision of the McCleary was that these local levies would be for truly non-essential extras. That was essentially the language of the core, that none of these can be like core basic requirements. But we continue to see that the proceeds from our local levy really do support, legally mandated services that we provide students. And that's just the reality that Kent and a lot of other school districts find themselves in.
Other questions?
And I realize we've been down this path before, but in the capital projects, clearly there is still the ongoing struggle of climate change and particularly heat as an expansive threat. And having older buildings. Is there any possibility of the state alleviating that, or do we absolutely have to have this because we're still playing catch-up?
I would probably prefer to defer to some of our capital professionals who are not readily available. I can say just generally, if I may, that there is some evidence that state policymakers are spending more time and attention to the issues of climate change. And even in this district, we've seen, for example, we think about synthetic fields differently now than we did 10 years ago, in part due to climate and changes in climate and patterns in precipitation and patterns in heat and et cetera. So I can't necessarily predict the future of what the legislature will or won't do for climate change, but there is evidence that they're talking about it. They almost have to, because it's no longer theoretical. It's manifesting in the day-to-day lives of folks.
And with older buildings, the number of HVAC systems that are on our buildings and the need to have a replacement schedule is just terrifying.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, and as the legislative rep, and I've gone to the WASDA meetings and sat in on a lot of sessions, there's a lot of talk about a lot of stuff, including climate change. It all sounds good, and just particularly focusing on transportation, special education, and all that, the meetings that I was really gearing up on. It starts out wonderful,
Yeah.
and then they just start axing.
Yeah.
And yes, they have made some improvement, but the problem overall, and I mean, this is not a discussion to have here, but there's so many things that the state has let go. The homeless issue, all of those things that, you know, those are the buzzwords now, and like it or not, I personally, this is just a personal opinion, they can talk about it, but I don't see that coming up in big money late in the future. It's gonna be a while. So, one thing I did want to make another personal comment too is, I've lived in my home for over 30 years now, and this is the first time, and I'll say something personal, that my property taxes went down, even during the recession. That was the big recession. Our land went up, our house went down, but my house, actually, property taxes went down a little. I was absolutely shocked. But I just, you know, so that could help some people too. You know?
Anybody have any other questions?
I just want to ask you a quick question about, if someone asks me, what will their tax increase be if we pass this?
Yep.
What should I say?
Sure. So you could use this slide here. Oops, sorry. You could use, I got a trigger finger here, this slide and
That's like.
this slide. But I'll just take a minute here to clarify for the record and for anyone who's listening, and because this is a frequently asked question. The district is not able and would never be able to tell an individual property owner exactly what would happen with their property taxes, either in total or as it pertains to the school district portion of local property taxes, for, just briefly, a couple of reasons. The first is that, for example, if we go out and ask for a fixed levy amount, as we do, and then there's new construction in the community, which we fully expect, now you have more homes paying the same tax bill, which would bring the cost down for an individual taxpayer. That happens in places like Kent, right? Where all of a sudden, certain areas of our community have explosive growth. Those are all taxpayers. We're on a 3-year levy. Originally, we assumed a certain number of taxpayers. Now it's very different. So that works to the benefit of an individual taxpayer. An individual taxpayer's assessed valuation, we have obviously nothing to do with the evaluation of each individual's property. So all we can do in good faith, and we've picked up on the fact that people, you know, say, yeah, okay, well, you're telling me the tax rate is flat, but my property tax still went up. So we're trying to respect that fact with these new slides to say the actual amount, the total amount that we are requesting, regardless of how many homes are paying for this, all the other assumptions, is designed to only go up by inflation. We tagged it to what people are projecting roughly the IPD range is going to be, which is 3.5%. The rest of it, we can't make any assurances either way. That's the only fact that we can really give people is here's exactly the amount we're putting on the ballot. Here are what our assumptions about future property growth and future tax rates. And then that's good faith on our part.
Thank you.
Can we talk a little bit about the list of projects?
Sure.
All wonderful, right? But we are estimating a certain amount of money to come, and we've talked about this before, right? With the difference between bonds and levies.
Yes.
Bonds, here's the projects, check them off, must be done, here's the list, we know where they're coming, right?
Yes.
Levies is a little bit different. I think I made the analogy to like my house where I have all these different projects I want to do, depending if you have a good deal on something or it works out with getting a contractor a certain time or whatever those things are. In my house, I might do a certain project at a different time. Levies are a little bit, in my mind,
Different.
different.
They
right?
are.
And so can you talk to me a little bit about, so we talked about the projects here.
Yes.
And the list of how that's going to happen going forward.
Sure.
And, you know, I know things happen, things fall off the list. Can things come up on the list? What does that look like? Can you talk about that process a little bit?
Absolutely. So the resolution itself makes certain representations as to the types of projects, right? So certainly we're bound by that. I'm trying to be sensitive to a couple more minutes on just checking in. On that explanation, bonds and levies are different. In fact, quite different. In a bond, you've got somebody else as part of the relationship, which is the purchaser of the bonds. And you're making certain representations as an organization about what the bond proceeds, you know, some giant insurance company spends millions of dollars on our bonds. We're making representations about what those proceeds will be, and then the Internal Revenue Service regulates that. And sometimes these bonds can take 20, 21 years to pay off. So it's a much more strict regulatory environment that's etched in statute about exactly which projects, and any changes to those projects come to the board in the form of a hearing, and we just went through that last year, and it's a very formal process when we bought the property over here because we were advised that only bond proceeds could be used for that, right? Capital levies do not involve bond purchasers. They do not involve a 21-year repayment plan. They do not, there's so much about that regulatory environment that doesn't, it's a levy. It's a kind of a pay-as-you-go philosophy. You're collecting tax proceeds for a year. You're representing a budget for that year. And so in the same way as an M&O or EP&O levy, if what our vernacular is, you know, the mechanism by which the board would be apprised of that is it's part of the annual budget process in the same way that the EP&O is. So it would be incumbent upon the capital team to come to the board and say, okay, we told you about the capital levy projects. It's very possible, and I would say probable, that 3 or 4 years from now, let's take 3 years, calendar year 27, the ordering and sequencing of the projects may very well change, and for very good reason, right? You might have had some natural event at a building where you're gonna have to reprogram to make sure that this particular roof is taken care of, right? And so it would be incumbent on the capital team to apprise the board of that as part of the budget process. But it's a different regulatory environment. It's a little bit of a colloquialism, but it's a little bit of a pay-as-you-go philosophy instead of $400 million up front, paid back over 21 years.
Totally makes sense, but, and I understand that with regulatory, there's different things that we would have because of a bond compared to a levy, but obviously still taxpayers and.
Absolutely,
And
and
bond-
still
and board
accountability,
oversight.
and still
And so,
accountability, yep.
Would there ever be a case that there would be a project that would start or begin without the board knowing ahead of time and making sure that it's on the list already?
I mean, we're getting to the point where I might want to, because Dr. Behringer's not here and he oversees that team.
Yeah.
I would say that if that were the board's will, if that was something that the board needed, that could be worked out with the superintendent in terms of the cadence of how that is informed. I personally wouldn't be comfortable going any further than that, but perhaps the superintendent can speak to that point.
Because I was going to make a comment regarding that as well. Like ultimately with the bond, it's very strict.
That's right.
Projects have to come to us. We have to make, but for the levy, it sounded like, reading the resolution, some community members were concerned. It just sounds like project will be done with our knowledge, but that necessarily wouldn't ever be the case. Like
Yeah.
we would always be apprised. Well, I would hope that we would always be apprised with the projects.
Yeah.
If things were going to change or go out of order. Like there's not a legal requirement, but we would still know about it, right?
Absolutely. And that language that I think people were responding to is not something we cooked up individually. That's part of the boilerplate language that is part of a capital levy, right?
If I may, definitely, President Beno is exactly right. Regardless, we, Board Superintendent Governance Team, is a team, and those projects that list, they're the same list. But if some were to come up different, or let's say something is not in one of the projects, it is Superintendent and Board President who continually are working, communicating together with the full board on, but it would be definitely with full knowledge of the board.
That's what I was just looking
Okay.
to make sure that it was said.
And he was the right guy to say it, so.
Because transparency is important, and I know that was a concern, but ultimately, the process is just different just because it's a levy versus a bond.
That's correct.
But we would always be apprised.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. I had a couple things I just kind of wanted to put out into the world.
I'm sorry, I still have one more question.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Could you just clarify your comment that you made at the beginning about it doesn't make sense to do one or the other? I'm assuming that they're going to both be put on the ballot separately.
That's absolutely right.
And
yeah.
it would still make sense if one got voted yes and the other one no. Let's
Right.
just say in a world.
Yes.
It would still make sense to go forward with that.
Yes, it would.
Okay.
What I was,
It makes sense for timing to put them together.
correct.
But the bonds in themselves, each is substantial enough and worthy enough on its own to be on its own, not having to have the other one partnered with it.
Yes, they must legally be separate resolutions.
Yes.
So that's not a discretionary thing we're doing. My comment, and thank you for the clarifying question. My comment was essentially that it really wouldn't make much sense, for example, to run the EP&O levy in November if you weren't going to run the capital levy in November. You see what I'm saying?
So it's a timing, not the
Correct.
Plus,
levies themselves.
Correct.
plus there is the charge for running the election.
Yes. That was the intent of my statement, and it's something that we talked about in preparation, that they're separate resolutions, and there might be a tendency for the board to vote on one and then reconsider and vote on another. And conceptually, they're linked. And for all the reasons we talked about, voter fatigue, all those issues, it just, I would argue it wouldn't be kind of consistent with the strategy that I've been hearing from the board over the last few months to end up with a scenario where you run one in November and then run one in February. We were trying to avoid that from the very beginning. That's what led to this whole conversation, so.
Thank you just for clarifying
Yes.
that comment.
And I'd just like to add to that, Mr. Rarick, this district has kind of set a precedent of doing that with the two separate being run at the time. And sometimes people are comfortable, not all, when they see things that are consistently done in a manner, and they're familiar with that, too.
Yeah, and that's right, and it's just not good practice to run
Yeah,
two ballots
I get it.
90 days apart. I mean, it's just, nobody would ever really recommend that.
Thank you.
Anybody have anything else? All right, I have a couple things, because I was just looking at some of the things that you were saying, and just the importance of, like, the school funding formula is not great in our state, which is why we rely on local levies and bonds, et cetera. In fact, isn't there a school district suing the state because they can't pass a bond? So it's just things like that where just because their buildings are in disrepair. And so ultimately, like, we didn't pass a bond, that's fine. And so we're looking at the levy, and the levy is supporting things that we have to pay for because the school funding formula doesn't necessarily fund those things.
That's right.
So what I heard is safety and security personnel. I heard 20 nurses over and above what the district offers. I heard things like highly capable special education. And for me, it's like, like, not being pessimistic, but both don't pass, we'll obviously run it again. But in the meanwhile, like, we need staffing for
Yes.
special education, otherwise we get sued.
Yes.
And so if a roof caves in on a group of students and we didn't pass the levy to fix that, like, my brain is like, liability, like, whose fault is that? Whose
Yes.
fault? But ultimately, we don't want things like that to happen, which is why we want to pass levies, especially the capital levy as well.
Yeah.
And even things like music, art, et cetera, whereas it's not necessarily mandated, but those are things that enrich students' lives, and we want to make sure that we have those things. We run IB in my school. IB is expensive. It's not part of the funding formula. I think they require $100,000 a year for an IB coordinator, courses, professional development, a $10,000 fee for the, like, and that's not covered. And so, and we don't want programs and things going away. So I'm trying to create kind of like a visual of some of these things that are needed. And then experiencing the hot weather recently, we need cooling systems. And we talk about climate change. We need AC cooling system. I know at my building.
And
I'm
we
glad
hear
we're getting
about that
renovated.
very consistently.
It's-
Very consistently.
We need appropriate heating and cooling. So there's a lot of things that I took notes on that's just really important, that I think that, like, I want to say into the world, because students are important to us. We want to make sure that we're giving students what they need, but also so that we understand if these don't pass, there's a lot of things that are not going to get funded, and those are the things that generally we hear from the public that we want. And so I appreciate, but do you have a number, like, if these don't pass? We can be optimistic, just realist.
Yeah.
Like, how much staffing would we lose?
Oh, I can't, this is probably the one thing I wanted to make sure we emphasize enough today. You know, the bond didn't pass and we live to, you know, fight another day. We cannot afford a negative outcome in this, November ballot. So just straight away, round numbers, we spent about $20 million, give or take, on our special education program out of our local levy.
Yep,
You know, $20 million.
yep.
And all the staff associated to serve those kiddos. Our class size is not fully state funded. The salaries for staff, straight away, are definitely not funded by the state. That is a clear, for every employee group. For every employee group, we pay more than the state gives us to pay. Where does that money come from? It comes from the local levy. So there are employee groups that think they're fully funded by the state, but they're, because they've looked at something about ratios or whatever, it's like, but your salary is not. You see what I'm, right? And that's literally for, I mean, every employee group that I can think of right now. So it really is, it is fundamental to the educational program that we offer. And, if you wanted a number, the ask, we're up to in the range of, I think we're currently at $76 million of our annual collections in the levy. Now, how much of that goes exactly to staffing or not would be, I'm doing some back of the envelope. But it's not a small, that was the point of that first slide. We're a very large and complex organization. We rely on the local levy. It's not a hope we get it. It is essential to the budget infrastructure of this district.
That's, hey, President Beno, thank you. You laid it out really well in terms of the importance of it. I wanted to add a little bit more about safety and health. Safety, for example, you saw the bullet there. In terms of the staffing, we actually get hardly nothing, 25% of what we actually have in our schools, over 20, at least 20 safety staff. For nurses is the same. What we get from a ratio from the state doesn't replace what we have currently. And I know Mr. Eric hasn't used that word replacement, but it is to be able to maintain some of the things we currently have is really what a lot of this is about. So if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point those pieces out.
Yeah. The EP&O levy is a replacement levy. It meets the technical definition of replacement levy in the sense that we're not, in the main, we're not proposing a giant new program. We're proposing to continue the program with some strategic enhancements adjusted for inflation. The only reason we're not calling the capital and technology level a replacement levy is because there's that 1-year lag that we talked about earlier. But in spirit, it is replacing the one-to-one initiative. It is replacing some of the smaller construct facility improvement work that currently happens in the capital levy. And so I cannot emphasize enough, and it's probably the number one takeaway today is the bond had more of a feel of, we hope we pass it, right? This is not a hope, we need to pass this levy as a district to continue our momentum. It is that big and that substantial and that fundamental to our program. And that means that there needs to be a galvanized support in this district.
And I'm sorry, I very much hear it, but I just want to hear it one more time. So what we are looking at for these is truly replacement. We're not looking to add new. It's really to maintain what we have.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the two levies separately.
Yep.
Because you're asking actually a technical question. Replacement levy means like a specific thing. We have determined that the EP&O levy is a replacement levy. So obviously, something small new will happen, right? I mean, we're opening some schools where, there's minor adjustments are being made. But the overall intent of the EP&O levy is to adjust by 3.5% to keep pace with inflation. Mm-hmm. It would be different if we were asking for 10% more or whatever, and the questions would be, well, what are you doing with this 10%? And, so certainly on the margins, we've got, we just opened a online school. We're opening up Canyon Ridge, and there'll be certain smaller costs that get incorporated in, but in the main, it is absolutely a replacement levy.
Can I pause right there?
Yes.
So thus, the projects that we would expect to see are all the projects that we already have and have already been doing. And so I think of it in maintenance.
Yes. Are we talking about the EP&O levy still?
Yes.
Okay, yes. I think that's a good faith representation on the part of the district. It continues the programs and services that the state has underfunded and that we have traditionally used local taxpayer money to support.
Like music in all the schools and ASB, well, not ASB, that's a different thing, but like things that are
Safety
staff, some
officers.
safety officers, et cetera.
Yes.
But the other one, like adding preschools, that wouldn't be replacement.
That's
why
right.
it's a capital
There you
levy,
go.
right?
That's why we talked about them separately.
Got it.
So the second one, we refrained from using the term replacement for two reasons. The first is that you saw there in that slide where it shows a year one, year two, right? So that year one is kind of replacement in spirit, but not technically replacement. So we went out for a bond and failed it, but the reason we went out for a bond was because our proceeds started to dwindle down, right? It was time for a re-up of our capital proceeds. We are trying to accomplish the first installment of that dedication of taxing authority strictly for capital construction and improvements in that first year. The second year is when the technology levy replacement kicks in. So it goes from here to here. The overall tax rate doesn't change. It's just the mechanism of the capital and technology levy. So we refrained from calling it a replacement because it's technically in that first year, I don't think you could, in spirit, you could say it is, but technically you can't. And the second thing is that it does include this commitment of pre-K expansion. And that is not a replacement thing, and it's also a relatively material part of this proposal. So we gain nothing by trying to call it a replacement, we just call it straight, right? There's enough that's new there to say that it's not, but as long as people understand that the total dollars are replacement, it's 3.5% essentially.
Well, as a mom that has struggled recently, near past, trying to find childcare for pre-K, like tears. It is one of the hardest things to do.
Yes.
And it is so tough. I'm so excited to see the district taking a step to help our families.
So impactful educationally, like the research is
huge on impact on families and the future of our kids and being ready for school.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
Well, and those dollars are going to come back in savings down the road.
Yeah.
That's what we feel.
If you can get them into
That's exactly.
really good preschools. So the other thing I think that's very imperative for our public to understand is failure of these particular levies is going to affect our kids and our students and our staff the most. So, and once you do that, if it comes to fruition, it takes a heck of a lot more money to dig out of that in the return. So, and I was at a WASBO meeting in Olympia where our superintendent of Washington Schools, Chris Reichel, talked, and he said, he didn't like to say it, but he thought maybe it's time. It's time that we gather together to perhaps get a lawsuit to get the model of our funding adequately done. So, and he got a roaring standing applause.
So to your question, I've had some team members that wanted to answer your question. At least 40 million of salary out of local levy, at least, probably more than that. And then to Board Director Clark's question, I just got some background information that the HVAC projects and needs have definitely been shaped by the climate change discussion, both in the timing of when schools rely upon it, the nature of the actual HVAC systems. Yeah, I think that's it for now.
Are there any other questions?
I just wanted to also emphasize that I like the idea of going for 4 years instead of 2 years because of what you talked about, which
Yep.
is voter fatigue, right?
Yes.
And it makes sense that that we have a break after we pass this
Yes.
for 4 years.
And recall that part of the strategy here, in addition to running them together here, is that at the back end, they both expire at the same time.
Same time, exactly.
So when you go back out, you go back out in tandem. People underestimate the amount of work, time, and cost
Yeah.
of these ballot measures.
Other questions, comments?
Great, thank you so much for your questions and robust discussion.
Awesome. So now let's move on to 3.0, which is discussion and approval. And I will take a motion for 3.01.
I move,
Oh, go ahead.
I move approval of Resolution 1649, Capital Projects and Technology Levy.
I second.
It's been moved and seconded. Let's open it up for discussion or questions.
I think we've been through this multiple times, and it's very clear that it's absolutely essential to retain a high-quality education system and taking into account the needs of everything from public safety to just fundamental needs of maintaining an older system of buildings.
And I would say that it's not just giving those, but other districts that will continue to have those programs, our students will fall behind if not given these opportunities for the enrichment that these programs give up.
In present times, with going through a panic, a pandemic and all the things that have come up and resulted from that, we want to have the very best that we can afford in this district to give our kids and our staff.
Can I ask one more question? Sorry, Mr. Eric, you went away. This has to be submitted to King County elections by when? And then are we going to be able to do that in time?
Mr. Eric?
Yes, so we need to certify, so once you pass the resolutions, sign the resolutions, that's the key thing, people need to sign the resolution for you. We will transmit those to the county tomorrow. The deadline is August 1st. Mr. Brockvogel, I think, is going to very shortly talk to you about the next step, which is the pro-con committee appointments. But all of that would transact either tonight or tomorrow morning, essentially, in our transmission of that to the county and to the selected members of the pro-con committees.
Awesome. Other questions, comments? Hearing none, I will call for the vote. All those in favor of 3.01, resolution number 1649, capital projects and technology levy, raise your right hand and say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. Seeing none, no abstentions, and the motion passes. 3.02.
I make a motion to approve Resolution 1650, replacement education programs and operational levy, also known as the EP&O levy.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. I will call for discussion or questions.
All right, once again, this particular funding process is absolutely critical, has been pointed out, for support of salary structure, employment of various groups that are absolutely essential to the running of the schools. The fact is, this has been an ongoing challenge, and I've been thankful that the community has supported us in continuing this fundamental financial approach.
Further discussion or questions? Hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor of 3.02, Resolution 1650, replacement educational programs and operations levy, raise your right hand and say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no, and then no abstentions. So the motion carries. And I'm going to pause here, I think,
Yep.
for,
Yep, thank you, President Beno. I would like Mr. Brockvogel to speak to next steps with the Procon Committee. Mr. Brockvogel.
Thank you, Superintendent Villa, President Beno, and members of the board, and Madam Clerk. Before you tonight is the opportunity to appoint two committees, one in favor of the measure, the levy, and one opposing it. In the past, we have not taken formal action from the board. In that you did not appoint these committees. We relied on past practice when we went out for the bond, and we relied basically, as Pacifica informed a couple weeks ago, on broad delegation in one of the resolutions. So under that theory, the superintendent would then take action pursuant to the delegation, and consistent with his statutory duties in 28A, a number of those statutes, at least one comes to mind, that his general authority. Second is as secretary of the board. But since then, we've had three constituents come out and suggest that the board has a duty to appoint these committees, and I think that's a reasonable approach. So we're recommending that you do that tonight. I understand that you are in receipt of certain names. It's our recommendation that you put those names on a pro and con committee. And I would just say parenthetically that if there was a deviation from this appointment process, that is not the fault of the board. We were following past practice. Staff was doing what it thought was best under its delegation, but if there's any criticism here, it certainly is not the fault of the board. And I just wanted to make that publicly stated. On the other hand, what we do know is that the statutory intent, the intent of having a pro and a con statement delivered in the voter's pamphlet was effectuated. That did happen in the last instance. So we don't think we're at terrible odds with the statute. So for those reasons and the reasons that Faith Pettis explained last time, I think we're in a good spot now to shift gears and to ask the board to make those appointments tonight. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
do my colleagues have any questions or anything they would like to say before we move on to the voting of the pro and con committee?
I got a couple of questions. So first, to appoint this pro and con, how do we come up with the names? Do they apply for this pro-con committees? Did we publish it, or how do we come up with this criteria?
Right. Thank you for that question. It's an interesting question. Some people have stated that we have an obligation to do outreach, though the statute specifically does not say that. So what we did do, because we did in the past have problems coming up with a con, we advertised on our website the opportunity to volunteer, and that was started on the 18th, I think, of this month. And we did receive names, and those names should have been forwarded to you for tonight's appointment.
Yes.
While I have the mic, one more thing. The budget narrative indicates that there was some discretion. Another constituent took some umbrage with the phrasing in the budget narrative. Really, what I was trying to tell you is that if the board, for whatever reason, does not appoint, and you should, because it's mandatory that you make this appointment if we go this route, then the county auditor will make that appointment. That was the point in the narrative.
Right.
And it was inartfully drafted. I apologize, but that was what I was trying to say.
I just trying to figure out, because I see some names, familiar names, and I was just trying to figure out how do we, are they the loudest, that spoke, or, because sometimes we tend to pay attention to the ones that are speaking the loudest, and we tend to forget. And as a person of color, I really don't see any person of color in that list. So I'm kind of thinking of how do we determine this list, and it's
one thing, if I can say, we did receive a complaint from a former board member, and we had a productive meeting. And what came out of that was perhaps some guidelines, some process where we engage in public outreach, where we emphasize who we want, if that's possible. But at least the board can weigh in on how we recruit these names. I thought that was a good outcome of that complaint process.
right.
But you're right.
Yeah.
The statute does not give any help in that regard. But the good news, I think, is that the board has an opportunity to develop its own policy, its own outreach, and its own objectives within the statute.
I'm sorry, so we're looking to move this forward for making the pro-con committees, and the names are already presented. If there are additional people who would like to be on these committee, can we talk about next steps of what this looks like? Could you help? Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to thank you, Mr. Brockvogel, if I may, and you can add to this to Director Farah and Director Margell. This is part of a process that the board is engaging in, pro-con. And that does not mean that these are the only members, that a committee can still have other members support this pro-con committee if the board approves. This is just the committee, that the names that go forward. And so, Mr. Brockwold, could you clarify that process in that?
Yeah.
I think that addresses Director Farah's question.
Yeah, yes, that's true. So, for example, you are limited to 3 people per pro-con, but the statute specifically says those people on those committees are not prohibited from reaching out, consulting with anybody they want to in the formation of the voters pamphlet position.
Okay, I see. So we're limited to 3 each.
Correct.
And the con committee just only gave us 2 names? How did we only end up with 2 names?
That's the only ones that volunteered.
Those are the
through
only
the process.
Okay, but those 2 have said, yes, I want to be on the con committee, and we are the 2. If they so choose, they can add an additional, and the pro committee can add additional people, well, both of them, at any time to help. They're just not the official 3 that are on. Okay, thank you for the explanation.
Thank you.
Are there staff that help the pro and con committee not write it, but meet the deadline, submit it, or is that just done by the committees themselves? I guess I need a little bit more clarification about that.
As far as next steps, Mr. Rarick did talk a little bit about this. If you want to share a little bit more, but we're prepared to send that, and part of it, President Benno, is advising them of their timelines and their specific duties, if you will. So, Mr. Rarick.
Yeah, so technically, once the pro-con committee is appointed, they're work is with the county at that point. But we do send a correspondence to say, here's what the law says about timelines, responsibilities, et cetera. That would actually go out like tonight or tomorrow morning. We've got it ready to go. So they'd be notified, whoever the board decides to appoint, they would be notified immediately. But then we don't like govern their work, right? We don't say what you can say, what you can't say. That really becomes the county's responsibility.
I was gonna ask that too, because someone can write, I think Hillary is the leader of the lizard people and we shouldn't pass this levy because and we don't edit that. That just goes, that the committee comes up with what they write and that is just submitted to them, right?
Yes, but there is an opportunity for rebuttal between the committees.
Yeah.
And that provides an opportunity to,
And there's a process in place for that too, because of deadlines and things to
that's right.
pamphlet
But
it.
just so it's clear, it is not the school board's responsibility to administer that process. It's the school board's responsibility to start it.
Correct.
Yeah, and in general, I've talked to our attorney and to President Bento. In general, I have a problem with the statute. I mean, it seems absolutely bizarre to me if we just unanimously approved, all the people up here, to support these levies or bonds or whatever it is, and then we're asked to find people in opposition, and usually, I mean, I recognize the Pro Committee has had an actual committee that's raised funds under their own way to do that, and has groups meetings and talks, and has input from the community. But just appointing a con committee, when I don't know honestly, the whole background of what they've done, or who's on that committee, or how much, research they've, like Director Sfera said, how much have they reached out to the community to have other con members on their community? To me, the statute, to have us being that are bringing this forward and finding cons to this argument is absolutely ludicrous. I mean, I think somebody should do that, but I don't think the board should be the legislative body that does it. And I think there should be strict guidelines, like you do have a committee, it is open, you are having other people have input into these committee, and welcome to do that. And I don't think that's our job. I mean, if they want to be on these committees and they feel that this is going to help them, I guess we'd have to go ahead with this tonight. But to me, I mean, how do I know? And I'm not using particular names here. I just happen to recognize the pros because I know what they've done in the community. But the cons, I mean, and I recognize their names too, but I don't know what they've done formally to form committees or raise funds for their committee or stuff like that, and that they're meeting regularly. I mean, we have a committee that actually supports our schools and our bonds and our levies.
If I can.
Sure.
Number one, there are citizen groups that we have used in the past that actually work on such things as what projects go into the bond. And inevitably, there are going to be some projects that aren't going to make the list because of timing and funding. And so they might take exception. And so they would be a logical choice to offer oppositions to what was actually proposed. So we do encounter them in those formal committees, but we don't necessarily aren't always, for instance, able to come up with 3 names that would have been working on those projects. But I remind you, this is state law that forced that into it.
I know. I said I have a problem with the statute.
As our legislative rep, I really want you to take a good look at that.
Write a letter.
Duly noted.
I hear you, and I've talked to people, whether you believe it or not.
And then also, to your point too, like citizens can start an advisory group for, or they can start an advisory group against.
Yeah.
And I mean, making sure they follow the proper guidelines and protocols to do those kinds of things, like people are able to do that, so.
And I wanted to add, President Beno, that along with the letter, if the board does move ahead with this, is the voter pamphlet, the jurisdiction manual will also be sent to them. So all those guidelines will be there with them, so.
Great.
Just wanted to add one more thing is that the support they request, either the con or the pro, the thing I wanted to make sure that, since we don't have we can't tell them anything, it would be advisable for them to reach out, this district, families of color, because this district is more than 71% families of color. So in order to make sure this, it's a fair, they should, and I'm advising it in a very strong word, is to make sure they should reach out to those families.
And my last point is, the nice thing about it is the rebuttal part that is required by the county elections usually points out glaring errors if somebody is misrepresenting something. So this is a normal process, and it does have some checks and balances.
Other questions, discussion, before we move on to 3.03? Oh, I hear Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brockvogel?
Thank you, President Beno. The only thing I would suggest is we didn't know when we put the agenda together how many folks would be on these lists. So we suggested the nomination process, which sort of accommodates multiple people for one spot. That's just a suggestion, Mr. President. So if you've got just two, and I think I just heard tonight there was just two on the con, you could do that by simple motion. And the same for the other if you've got three.
Thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
One more thing, how well, one of the things that I keep hearing in the community, that we're not communicating a lot of stuff, even though it's been on, you get robocalls and it's on our website and everything else. How many people are aware that tonight we're voting on a pro and a con committee and have had the opportunity to be a part of that?
That's what I was asking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and we-
that's what I was asking.
To answer that question,
this is, and how do we get that word out?
Director Hamada, just to understand the question, this is for the pro-con committee, or is
Yeah.
this for the whole process?
No, the pro-con committee.
So
Or
that-
the pro-con committee, I guess.
Okay, that was, we answered that earlier, that we had time for volunteers. It closed last night, and the names that President Beno will read are those names. So.
Yeah, I get we did a process, but it's the middle of summer. Just saying. A lot of people are actually enjoying their summer.
Well, I was going to say, as you recall, like, we added this meeting for this discussion because of deadlines, et cetera. So,
Oh, boy.
yep. Other questions, discussion? All right. So we're going to go to 3.03, and we have a process for how we're going to do the pro-con committee. We're going to take a roll call vote for the proposed slate of the people on the pro committee and those on the con committees, and we're going to do that separately.
Okay.
And we're going to begin by taking roll call for the pro committee. So I'm going to read the list of the names of the people on the pro committee. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask for a vote. I'm going to ask each board member individually, and the vote will be an oral call. And when you're called to vote, you're going to say aye, or you're going to say no, and raise your right hand. And then we'll just go through that process.
Okay.
Any questions about that? Or Mr. Brockvogel, did you have a question about that?
no,
Oh, perfect. Does that make sense? Am I able to move forward? Okay,
It makes sense.
great. So we're going to take a roll call vote for the pro committee first. And the proposed members of the pro committee that submitted their names are as follows. 1 is Allison Johnson. 2 is Alan Sutliff. And 3 is Brooke Valentine. I'm going to call on each board member individually to vote for the proposed slate of pro committee members. You're going to please raise your right hand and say aye as I call your name. Aye or no as I call your name. Director Farah, what is your vote?
Aye.
Director Clark, what is your vote?
Aye.
Director Hamada
Aye.
and Vice President Margell.
Aye.
And I guess I'm supposed to vote too. There's a reminder that I have to vote, and I'm going to vote aye as well. The proposed slate of pro committees looks like it is approved 5-0, and they will be notified that they are on the pro committee. That was pretty good, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's go to,
Point of information.
oh, yes, please.
What happens if on either side of the pro or con committee that we put forward tonight decide they don't want to be on the pro or con committee?
I don't have an answer to that. I would, from my view would be like, just, so you just wouldn't be on it, but I'm gonna go ahead and defer to Superintendent Vela and
Yeah.
Mr. Brockvogel.
Yeah, the duty of the board is what we're doing now.
Okay.
And from that point forward, we would not be involved with it. Again, remember, this is just sending the names as a slate. They can have other members support it, but as far as someone, quitting or whatever, that's their prerogative.
But the committee still exists,
That's what we
and then the
appointed.
members within it can change as their prerogative, okay?
And would we be responsible as a board if there's no members on this committee on either side at the end?
If there are no members,
Would we have to come again and appoint some? Because we'd
No.
be falling short of our duties?
no, we would not. This is
Okay,
part
just
of our
wanna make
duty right
sure.
now.
Just want to make
If the-
sure.
I will clarify, though, that if the board did not vote, then the county auditor would do that.
Right.
That's the responsibility. And so, but to answer your question, no.
Thank you.
Because the state law says we're mandated to do it,
Right.
but then also says if we don't, then the county, like, it's funny because it says we mandated.
Yeah.
But if we don't, then the county will do, which is interesting language to me.
That's that's why I say this whole
And quite hon-
statute is
Quite
crazy.
honestly, districts around the state have a difficult time sometimes
Yeah.
finding
Yeah.
both pro, unfortunately, but con.
Yeah.
And that's where a county auditor comes in. Thank you.
Great question. All right, are we ready to move to the con committee? Okay, so the next roll call vote is going to be for the con committee, and the proposed members of the con committee are as follows. One is Sean Bettinger, and then two is Joseph Riley. I'm going to call on each board director individually to vote for the proposed slate of con committee members. You're going to raise your right hand and say aye or nay or no. Director Farah, what is your vote?
Nay.
Director Clark,
Aye.
Director Hamada,
Aye.
Vice President Margell.
Aye.
And then I'm supposed to vote because it says that, and I'm going to vote aye. So 4-1, the proposed slate of con committee members is approved, and they will be notified. Great, let's go to 4.0. We're going to start with 4.01, gift acceptance.
It's
I
consent-
move to approve, oh,
Oh, it's consent. It's a
agenda,
consent.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, I need to ask, is there anything that people would like pulled from the consent agenda? Which is why I looked at Director Clark, because I knew he was going to talk about 4.01.
Correct, I'd like to pull gift acceptance, thank you.
Any other
It's
items
4.2.
that board members would like to pull?
Which is 4.01.
Seeing none,
normally
I
all
would
the
like a motion that we accept 4.02 through 4.04 on the consent agenda.
Move to approve consent agenda items 402, 403, and 404.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor of voting for the consent 4.02 to 4.04, raise your right hand and say aye.
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 All opposed say no. It's none. There's no abstention, so the motion passes. 4.01.
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge, again, the fine work of our PTAs that at Cedar Valley Elementary, helping out with needs in that for around 600. And Fairwood PTSA for support for a special field trip of over $1,000. And then, of course, there's the boosters clubs, both at KM boys and girls and basketball, each going for around $1,500 to get a item to assist in their basketball program. And then finally, the ASB accounts at KM getting a gift from the Northwest Canine Snifters for $6,450. These are things that really enhance programs, and we appreciate the sacrifice of that. And with that, I'd like to move approval of 401 gift acceptance.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. I do have a question. For the Cedar Valley Elementary School, for the PTA, it says use of copier machine. Is that because they get charged to use the copy? We don't allow the PTA to just use materials? Can I ask that question? Because that seems weird. Or is it a donation for a new copier? Like,
Yeah.
I had a question.
No, thank you, President Bennett. I'll have Mr. Eric hopefully can answer that one.
I know it seems counterintuitive, but by law, outside organizations must be charged something. Usually when it's the PTA or some of our partner organizations, we charge a very, very small amount, but we have to charge something, otherwise it constitutes, at a certain level, a gift. So I don't like it any more than you do, but we try to navigate that and make as much sense of it as we can.
Okay. Thank you. And other questions about that?
Thank you, Mr. Eric.
All right. So seeing no other questions or comments, I will,
Yeah, go ahead, vote.
I was going to vote on 4.01. So all those in favor of 4.01 gift acceptance, raise your right hand and say aye.
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 All opposed say no. There's none and no abstentions. So that takes us to 5.0, which is adjournment time. And it is 6:11, and I will now adjourn our special meeting.
And we sign